Welcome to the 11th in our series of conversations with some of the top leaders in the sector. Today we have two of, I think the sector's kind of most sought after speakers because they're on most of the conferences, and I think there's a really good reason for that. And they are Sarah Hughes and Danny Sriskandarajah. And so, well, first, before I do introductions, thank you, Sarah, thank you, Danny, for joining us today. For those of you who don't know, as if there's anybody, Sarah is Chief Exec of Mind. She's also a trustee of Global Leadership Exchange, a fellow of Skiana Health Leaders Network and Salzburg Global, and a board member of, I had to write this down because there's so many, a board member of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough CCG. But she's also one of the most interesting people to follow on LinkedIn. She has a fantastic blog and writes some incredible things on there. So I would encourage you to follow Sarah's writing if you don't already. And Danny is the Chief Exec of New Economics Foundation. He's author of the book. And I didn't have to do this, but I'm doing it because I would definitely recommend this book. It's really good. Congratulations, Danny, for getting the book done. He was also Chief Exec of Oxfam GB for 5 years, 5 quite tricky years in the period of the history of the organisation. Before that, he was Chief Exec of Civicus and Director General of the Royal Commonwealth Society. So, Sarah, Danny, once again, thank you very much for joining us. Now, at the risk of blathering on, throughout all of these conversations, so this is the 11th in the series, there's always been a sense that if we seriously want as organisations to change society, to change systems, to move us towards those wonderful vision statements that we have, then there is an element about us needing to change as well. And I know both of you, Danny and Sarah, you've spoken at length about aspects of that. So before we get into specifics, I guess I'll start with you, Sarah. Before we get into specifics, what are your thoughts on particularly how the charity sector sees itself versus the reality, and perhaps versus how the sector needs to become in order to start to achieve more of its vision in the future?
Well, thank you for having me. And I love listening to other people talk about me as if I'm not here, because it always kind of it freaks me out a bit, but makes me also think, oh, all right, yeah, I'm not doing too bad. So it is great to be here. And I think that this is a conversation that I'm really happy to have and think we should be having. And I suppose that really leads me to my key point, which is I do think that we've got a little bit of an optics problem. And not just optics in terms of the public looking in at who we are, but who we think we are. And I mean, I agree with Danny and many others, Jonathan from NPC too, that I have a real problem with us being called the sector. Because what is the sector? Who is it? What do we look like? What do we mean? What do we do? I mean, if you compare, Mind with a charity that's working down the road, providing a support group for our local community, they are not the same things, right? But they are somehow in the minds of the public and sometimes ourselves the same thing, and they really aren't. I think there is something about the notion of charity. So I don't like the word, right? I would just chuck the word out immediately if I could, because I think it's such a disingenuous way of thinking. I think it's very kind of colonial. And, I've said many times that, the first charities were created when the men were wandering the villages, knocking on the doors to get the money to pay for the wood to burn the witches. So, charity has its kind of origins in really dark places. And I think sometimes we fantasize about ourselves and forget some of that. And it gets played out, right? It still gets played out in terms of how we think about, deliver and engage with our, beneficiaries or our communities, whatever way you want to call it. I think that we've got this kind of idea that we're a fluffy family of, mission-led organizations. I think that's quite far from the truth, certainly today. I think we have a workforce that is both brilliant, wonderful, but also challenging and sets us apart from other parts of industry or other sectors or other whatevers. So I think that there is a dissonance between us the kind of image of us out there and the consensus in terms of where we think we're going. And so I think we should be actively working to kind of disavow ourselves and kind of bring us down, right? But how we get there, I sadly think might be just because the money will run out and things will become too difficult. Other than ideally what I would prefer, which is collaboration and working deeply with people who need our support. So I could kind of ramble on, but I think I'll hand over to Danny, and I'm sure we'll come back to it.
Danny?
Yeah, no, hi everyone. Thanks, Martyn, for having us. It's fabulous to see some amazing familiar faces and some others I don't know. Yeah, I think that when I worked at Civicus, which you mentioned, which is the sort of global civil society umbrella body, or really the sort of umbrella of umbrella bodies, what struck me was the sort of there is something peculiar about the UK context. And one of the peculiarities is that we do, for better or for worse, have this amazing formal civil society landscape. We have 160 odd thousand formal registered charities, many of which have been around for decades, if not hundreds of years, some of which employ thousands of people. Last time I checked, it was sort of 7% of the British workforce was employed by one form of registered charity or another. And we have this amazing sort of civil society infrastructure, including fabulous bodies like the NCBO, being about to be led by the fabulous Kate Lee. And that's in some ways an amazing heritage to have, because many other countries that don't have anything like that would be jealous of the fact that we have a sector, an established sort of landscape, sector bodies, infrastructure, and so on. But the downside of that is that and this is the sort of the curse bit of the blessing, is it can then limit us or limit civil society, because before you know it, many people, including us, but also, say, policymakers who deal with civil society, forget that the true power of civil society lies in our diversity, and almost certainly sort of, the really meaningful, powerful moments of transformative change that happens in society happen often outside the organized bits of civil society. It happens because of spontaneous movement or protest. It happens because social enterprises are doing some creative things at the boundary between charity and the market, or civil society and the market. And so there is a challenge to sort of broaden the lens, if you will. So at Civicus, for example, we didn't talk about the sector at all, because in most countries that didn't make sense. We talked about civil society and the importance of having a strong sort of organized bit of civil society, i.e. registered charities or non-profits. But those organized bits needed to be buttressed by, linked with all the other bits of civil society that sort of are important and essential to sort of civic life. And then the other thing that's worth saying about sort of sector is that even in the sort of 25 years or so I've been knocking about in civil society of one form or another, working almost all of that period in a registered charity, there's far more shape-shifting going on, or boundary blurring going on, than I would have expected 25 years ago, right? That the sort of the growth of B corporations and social enterprises, cooperatives and mutuals and all sorts of other formations in civil society that are purpose-led or change-making, that are non-profit making. There's a plethora of other formations in and around the organized bits of the sector. That also another challenge. So this is a definitional issue, but I think there's also a sort of operational issue in a very rapidly changing landscape, in which those of us who do work for organized bits of society have to sort of navigate, how do we protect what's best about us, but in a very rapidly changing landscape. So I agree with you. The sector maybe has sort of, it's a term whose time has come, perhaps. Let me stop there.
It's fascinating just listening to you both, because what you're talking about there, Danny, the kind of double-edged sword almost of having this establishment that, most of the change happens outside of it. But also the blurred boundaries and the fact it's changing very rapidly does I mean, some of that change from what Sarah's just describing is long overdue in terms of the historical connotations, and as you said, Sarah, the way that this plays out still in how we engage and how people see about us. There's one thing that I hope I've put down a note because I want to much later. I want to come back to this, which is about the unique workforce challenges. There's something very specific there. I want to get to that, but I just in terms of all those changes and the headwinds that I've spoken about before, that there's this stuff is not happening in isolation. So I just been reading this week, about AI and the dangers as well as the potential implications of it, social bubbles and fragmentation of communities, the whole post-truth piece, growing inequality, public services, well, we know where they are, all of the impact that's having on civil society, etc. While dealing with our own organisations, the need to reshape, the need to adapt with these blurred boundaries, etc. I mean, that's just a flavour of some of the things that chief execs are getting kind of hit with, appearing in their inbox all the time. But what would you, Sarah, you're nodding there, so I'll come to you first. But what, out of all of that smorgasbord of stuff, the big forces that are facing us, what would you pull out as being the kind of biggest, most consequential for us, for society? What are the things that we need to be mindful of when we're having these discussions?
So I think I mean, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because when you start thinking about the number of things going on, you've just named them, they're all terrifying in equal measure. And so to really kind of pick one out is quite a challenge. But I guess for me, one of the big challenges I think is really interesting is that you have all of these challenges happening and they are real. They are pervasive and persistent, and I hate the word, but they are unprecedented. I'm always interested in those people who say, "Oh no, it's not any more difficult than it was 10 years ago," because I bloody well think it is, and for all of the reasons that you've described. But I think that the thing that bothers me most is the rise of the right and the rise of heroic leadership and this notion of control. And when I think about the issues around protest and those sorts of things, so I think it feels almost like the response to all of these multitude of challenges is to kind of take more control. That's obviously what we do. That is how we have responded for centuries, right? We get pissed off, we go to war, we feel like we're losing control, so we'll take people's rights away. And we're firmly back in that space right now. And how we talk about that, I think, in civil society is really hard because there are rules, right? I'd really, there are things I want to say very specifically, but know that broadly there is a kind of rising tide against me in that position and our organisation's position. So I guess I'm worried about how we approach these challenges almost more than the challenges themselves. And what does leadership look like today? And I think that we're going back to a kind of command and control. And I think as a feminist leader, that's terrifying.
Really, really interesting. Just before I come to Danny, that I did a chief exec breakfast call last week that was on the rise of the right and the shift, the populism, hello leadership, etc., and how what that means for civil society organisations trying to navigate it. And there's only a couple of people on this call were there, but it was one of the least attended of all the calls I've done, and the sense from the colleagues that joined was that this is not really something that's easy to talk about, and it's not really there's not a lot of conversation going on about it at the moment. So fascinating that you've raised that. Thank you for.
Well, it is started to be raised in our federation, and even within my workforce, they're saying, what are you going to do about reform? As if I can do something about them. But they're asking me, what are you going to do? How are you going to engage them? Are we going to talk to them? What are you going to say? What's our position? And it's becoming harder and harder to pretend that they don't exist.
Yeah, agreed. So Danny, I mean, either feel free to build on that, but the original question for you, the clean slate question, was what would you pick out as the most consequential, biggest things facing us?
Well, that was a pretty depressing list of things you read out earlier. And you probably do a podcast episode on each of them. But let me build on Sarah's, I think, because I'm going to maybe cut it slightly differently, but come to the same conclusion, which is like I worry about civic freedoms, or civic space, as some people call it, which underpins the freedoms, the rights, the ability that all of us have, and all of the organizations we happen to work in, if we do work in organizations, should have, to organize, take action, mobilize, speak out, and so on. And I worry for a bunch of reasons. I mean, the world over, civic freedoms are being undermined. I mean, look at something called the Civicus Monitor, which is a sort of real-time assessment of every country in the world and what's happening to those fundamental freedoms of association, expression, of assembly. And almost everywhere in the world, things are going backwards. Secondly, look at this country. I mean, if you take the Civicus Monitor, for example, just in the last 5 years, the UK has been downgraded twice on a 5-point scale in terms of what's happening to the right to protest, the sentencing of protesters, the demonization of people who speak out, attempts by governments of all sorts to curb the ability of civil society to do our job. And so it's a global worrying trend that seems to be rearing its ugly face here as well. And, most, on vulgar display, this phenomenon is what's been happening to the arrest of protesters in recent weeks. We saw 900 arrested this weekend, 450 a few weekends ago. You don't have to agree with what they are protesting about, but 450 and 900 people who are protesting peacefully, being arrested and then charged with anti-terrorism legislation and potentially facing huge penalties, including jail time. It to me is a really unhealthy sign of a sort of democracy that's under threat. And then it relates to Sarah's point, because unless you have a free, open, vibrant civic space in which we can speak truth to power, debate, discuss, live controversial issues, you don't have the sort of democratic arena that is necessary for the rest of democracy to work, right? So civic space in some ways is the foundation on which other bits of democracy are built. And I worry that, if you couple what's happening at the sort of in terms of politics, electoral politics and all of that, with what's happening in terms of civic space, and then add into that mix the sort of gutting of many sort of those mainstream bridge building institutions, whether it's defunding community centers, youth groups, a whole bunch of community infrastructure that would have allowed community members to talk to each other, to identify where, spot where problems might arise, address them, maybe put some resources in, maybe have those meaningful conversations to bring people together. All that good stuff that civil society does to keep the social fabric from fraying is also, I think, being undermined. And I think so for me, that's the sort of political challenge is not just about what's happening in electoral politics. It's what's happening in terms of people power and how it's being sort of systematically undermined in various ways. And that's super dangerous.
See, this is why you guys are on the speaker circuit so much, because it would have been so easy, I think, I don't think it's the wrong way, but it would be very easy for Sarah to say, the biggest issue is mental health. And Danny, for you to talk about, poverty or income inequality or market failure, whatever it is. But these things, they may feel a little bit abstract, but I sense that they relate fundamentally, that cohesion power, the loss of control almost from communities and fragmentation, that they do link directly towards the things that civil society organizations like yours are actually. So just speak to me a little bit about, if you can, how does this stuff that we've just been talking about relate directly to the pointy end of your own organizations?
Well, I mean, I don't think any of us in this room needs to be a kind of mental health professional to know that the mental health of the nation is in crisis. And I think we've got a lot of really interesting narratives going around, which kind of really chimes with what we've been talking around in terms of mental health has become a political football in a way that it hadn't been for a very, very long time. The moment for mental health in the sun has passed. And that's not just because of cycles, it's because of political and social headwinds accelerated by and through the pandemic. So, we are seeing both simultaneously a rise in mental health need, a rise in mental health demand. Need and demand aren't the same thing. And in parallel, a reduction in our ability to provide services because of depleting funds, and a rise in stigma towards people with mental health challenges or mental illness. So in all kind of areas or all directions, it's pretty bleak, right? It's pretty bleak. And I think that we have equally within society real generational and social differences about mental health and disability, and this whole narrative about workplace, which is where the kind of workforce, the future of work needs to be thought about more carefully, and we need to face the truth about what's happening. So for instance, again, all of these contradictions, we've got hybrid working, which the majority of us around this table in this Zoom room will be part of. But, simultaneously, that is not great for mental health, right? So on one hand, it's great because it gives some flexibility in equality terms. But actually, from an employer's mental health perspective, you can't maintain your duty of care towards a pixelated screen, right? You just can't do it. And so we have to be able to acknowledge that, yes, we're gaining this, but we're giving that up, right? So we're gaining the ability to be flexible employers, to attract all sorts of new people. But ultimately, we are giving something up in terms of connection and duty of care. And so I could go on about the mental health of the nation for quite some time, but social media, AI, 5 years ago, I would not have been in a position to say these things are bad for your mental health because the evidence kind of wasn't there. It's still not there in well enough forms for me to, maybe bet my life on it, but I'll bet my life on it that it's not good for your mental health, right? And so with AI, we're doing exactly what we did with social media, is that it's live before we've got any guardrails and we're catching up. So now we've got ChatGPT acting as a pseudo therapist, and people are developing AI psychosis. That's really happening. It's not just a really great tabloid headline. So yeah, I'm stressed about it.
I don't think you're the only one. I mean, Danny, what's your take on how the stuff that we were talking about control, power, rise to the right, etc., how that impacts the kind of topics that your organisation is most close to?
Well, maybe I'll do two if I can. One sort of negative and one positive, maybe, just so that we're not all doom and gloom this evening. So the negative one is what's happening around economic inequality. So some of you, I hope, will know the New Economics Foundation. We're about to turn 40 next year, and all of that time, the organisation's been trying to sort of, I suppose, in some ways, sound the alarm on an economic system that's broken, that was extractive of the planet, but also leaving people more unequal, unhappy, or uncertain, insecure, and so on. And we're seeing that. I mean, if you read our founding documents and the sort of warning about the impact of neoliberalism made in the 1980s, and you see what's happened in those 40 years, it is really worrying because, take inequality, for example. I think we're already, if not about to become, the second most unequal society in the OECD, just behind the US, right? So we think of ourselves as a Western European social democracy in which social mobility is high, but we actually are hurtling towards a sort of US-style economic system in which more, inequality is rising, insecurity is rising. And the problem with that is you can't have a functioning democracy in a deeply unequal society. I don't think you can also have a functioning civil society in a deeply unequal society, because you end up with where we're heading, which is those of us who want to do public good have to rely on the voluntary donations of a small elite. So we've got a deeply broken economic system, and we have to go cap in hand to the winners of that unfair and unjust system to beg them for some resources here and there to do the good work to fix the damage that the economic system is wreaking on society. And so we need a fundamental reset on inequality, and all the more reason why we need active, vocal civil society to challenge some of that, but also to show that there are other ways to rewire and reorganize our economy. And this is the sort of positive bit, which I love. One of the things I love about working at NEF is that it's always been what some people call a do tank, thinking through how might a new economy work. And the good news for, I suspect, all of us on this call, or if you're listening, is communities and civil society have to be at the heart of a truly sustainable economy, right? That an economy that's going to work for people and planet can't be about extracting value. It can't be about big companies with nameless, faceless shareholders that are just sort of siphoning resources. It's got to be about more democratic forms of ownership. It's got to be about cooperatives and mutuals and credit unions. It's got to be about true value, not just extracting profit, but what people call triple bottom line, or social return, or whatever else you want to, whatever way you want to see it. It's got to be about generating value at the sort of foundational economy, and that's where civil society, I think, is potentially, at the vanguard of the sort of changes we need to see. Because the stuff that I get really excited about is when local community groups are building social enterprises from the ground up, where they're showing how less extractive forms of economic organization can work. They're experimenting in new ways of circulating money. Like many of you remember the Brixton pound or the Preston pound and other forms. Civil society were at the heart of those sorts of experiments to show that actually this is not the only way we can organize our economy. And if we do that sort of stuff more, then I think we can both stop the most damaging bits of the way the current economy works, but most importantly, give people a sense of that another world is possible. Civil society at its best, in my view, is when we show that another world is possible, when we can channel hope and demonstrate things. And that, I think, the sort of demonstrating the new economy in practice should be ripe for civil society, even the sort of bigger end of charities. What you mentioned, I worked at Oxfam. I loved all the policy work and the international development work that Oxfam did, but I really loved the shops, right? I loved the fact that here were 500 odd shops showing what a circular economy might look like, relying on 20,000 volunteers, creating a community, and through it, generating, give or take, £20 million worth of unrestricted income for the charity to go and do other works, right? So you think, like, what an amazing model of social enterprise at scale, doing good things for the environment, strengthening communities, and also generating unrestricted income for the rest of the charity to go and do good stuff. Like, that's the sort of models we should be testing and building in other bits of civil society, and again, channeling hope and possibility.
Funnily enough, I was going to, you've segued me beautifully, Danny, into what's the upside on all of this? So, what's the positive? What needs to change, and what gives you a reason to believe? And you've talked a little bit about sort of an alternative vision, because I think partly in response to some of the things that Sarah talked about, which I get completely. When our causes and the factors that affect our causes become these sort of wedge issues, this simplified policy and simplistic debates, lack of any nuance, although that's disastrous for many of us in the sector, the pressure that it puts on individuals. But the way that you described it, Danny, that sort of active, vocal civil society coming together, community engagement, community ownership, solutions, demonstrating solutions. You talked about vanguard, innovation, experimentalism. They just, I guess, Sarah first, because you've not spoken for a little while, but what is, I mean, For you, what are the reasons to believe? What is the kind of positive solution that we should be holding up, and the reasons to believe that we can actually make a difference to these things?
Because we're doing it, and we just need to go and see it and be part of it and feel it. And I think for leadership, it's really important to get engaged. And so we certainly, in big organizations, it can be really easy to kind of be very remote from anything that's real. And frankly, I think that is really dangerous, and kind of lures you into this idea that your charity is having impact when it actually probably isn't having very much impact at all. And we have to face it, don't we? If we look at, mental health, for instance, there are some things that have been changed, but it hasn't changed enough despite our best efforts. So you could say change just takes a long time, or you could also say we haven't always got it right. And if we said we haven't always got it right and there is another way, what is the other way? And, I believe our role is to hold on to hope when all hope is lost. I think that's part of civil society's role, and that we have to be able to demonstrate things can be better. And so I think utilizing the experiences that we've got, the shops, the community cafes, the the mutual aid, I think that is where those are the glimmers. I think that people, are interested in what Mind have got to say, but they're really only interested in the difference that we're making. And so where are we making that difference, and who makes a decision about whether the difference has been made or not? And so I think it's about us getting close to the action, to removing all of the layers that are between us and what happens. I think we need to take a bit of a leaf out of Wes Streeting's book, which I don't do very often right now because he's also in my bad books and on a naughty step. But I think he's bravely talking about a removal of bureaucracy that we could do very well to think about in our own organisation. So, I think we have to imagine. We have to take some risks. We behave, well, certainly sometimes we do at at Mind, like we're the BBC. We're not the BBC, the charity sector, the civil society sector. We are, by our very definition, meant to kind of both hold up a mirror, but also be part of the community. And the closer we are to government, the harder that is too. We can talk about diplomacy. We can talk about, the great strides that collaboration with government has created. I think there's a limit to that, though. And I think we're very close to it.
And you've both talked about community there, and the sort of, well, presumably, am I just inferring that there is a need to collaborate at a community level, or I mean, is that something that I'm projecting, or is that something that you would buy into?
Yes. Maybe that's my segue into the sort of your question about sort of hope, which is like when I was researching the book, the thing that surprised me, and maybe you all know it, but I didn't, and I feel silly for not doing it, is I think for most of my career, I've been focusing on sort of two values of society and forgotten there was a third. And the first two roles that society, like civil society, plays is around fixing things, right? So when people, the sort of collaboration, when people come together voluntarily, not because they have to, not because they want to try to make money, not because they have, because they're part of their family and they're trying to sort of do something. It's outside their family, outside the market, outside the state. People come together and say, there's something that needs fixing in my community. Let's work together to do it. That's voluntary action at its best, or at its purest. And that's the sort of collaboration bit that civil society, and I suspect all of us, love that, are passionate about that. There's another bit, which is what I was talking about earlier, which is civil society being the sort of speaking truth to power, that civil society is the sort of buttress of democracy, the foundation of democracy. Not all of us all the time, but all of us almost all of the time need to pay attention to that and stand in solidarity, even if we're not campaigning organizations, doing our bit to make sure that others who, are not. But the third bit that I didn't sort of really think through enough was what some people call sort of, I suppose it's, Sarah, it's coming to mental health and other issues, that being part of civil society, being part of a community, being part of voluntary organizations, volunteering, whatever else, is important and maybe essential to human flourishing. And we've sort of forgotten that almost every philosophical tradition suggests that you can't, human flourishing is impossible unless humans find ways to channel a sense of purpose. And sadly, the market or working or, all the sort of economic stuff that we've done generally doesn't give people purpose. That's a problem. We can fix that in other ways. But the stuff we do outside in civil society generally gives people purpose, right? So the volunteer football coaches on a Saturday morning and, in the common up the road from where I live aren't particularly good. I'm not a particularly good coach. But the fact that I get out there, I'm part of my community, do things and put my limited talents to use gives me a sense of satisfaction, of connection, of fulfillment. It's what, Greek philosophers would call eudaimonic happiness, not hedonic happiness, that it's not about consuming things and doing things and that sort of happy, frivolous sort of happiness, but it's a deep happiness of putting your talents to use. And I think ultimately civil society is about that. And all those things that Sarah was talking about in terms of the sort of how the digital transformation is wreaking havoc on our lives and our mental health, like we hold some of the cure for that, right, in civil society. Because we can say, actually, it might still be digital connections, but hopefully more in real life connections, the sorts of ways in which people can come together and do good stuff, sometimes take action and speak truth to power and mobilize, get arrested, all that stuff is really important for all those other instrumental reasons, but it's also inherently good. And I think we've sort of somehow, particularly in the West, forgotten the sort of the inherent value of civil society, of collaboration, Martyn, as you put it. And we need to sort of remind everyone around us that without it, there's no such thing as society.
There's a really interesting link, I think, between what you've just been describing about that, a vehicle for that eudaimonic happiness, the sort of human flourishing, that sense of belonging, the sense of being able to do something purposeful. And what Sarah was talking about earlier in terms of the knee-jerk reaction to take control of how we respond. And this feels like, there is potentially a vehicle that we offer for people to have more purposeful influence on their communities and on their lives, which doesn't involve, going to a march and getting heroic leaders. I don't know, Sarah, am I joining two dots there that should be joined?
I mean, I think what we really need to be, I kind of, pushing, I think Danny's right, this is our essential value to society, is that we are conveners, brokers, compassionate ambassadors, we're all of those things. That's all very true. I think we need to give space, though, saying that I'm talking about big charities or, the social business charities. We need to give back space to community work and to really kind of make sure that we're prioritizing and showing off the absolute clear benefits of doing so. I do know that mental health is made in community. I do know, though, that community is hugely at risk, not just because of the kind of tech revolution, but also because some of our assumptions about what people want and need. So, for example, we still make assumptions about children and young people. Children and young people are desperate for human connection. They are absolutely desperate to get away from tech as the vehicle for knowledge, community and relationships. And so I think that we need to unlock the potential, really think about asset-based approaches. We're very, very deficit orientated at the moment, very understandably so. It's a mindset. My kids talk about the growth mindset all the time, and I think Ndidi does as well, actually. But what would happen if we did that? What would happen if we actually talked about the work that was done in an asset-based, almost, I challenge my colleagues at work to talk about it in a kind of commercial sense, because I feel like sometimes that lands in a way that our language just doesn't land. So I think there is an optimism in me. I do think that we have a huge amount to offer, but I think there needs to be some truth telling. I think we need to face, the limits of our prowess, the truth of it, that we haven't fixed anything after centuries of being in existence. So now what? What's the option? And the option is to kind of go hard on the radical end of the spectrum and fight for every aspect of community and asset building that we can.
And that's quite a big shift in orientation. And I was just wondering, as you were talking about that, question for both of you, because we've talked about a lot of different things here, but if you were kind of, talking to civil society, as you both do on a regular basis, where should civil society organizations be shifting? And perhaps they are shifting already, and it's just about continuing our pace, or perhaps they're not already. But in terms of whether it's self-image, whether it's orientation, whether it's relationship with the communities, whether it's all that stuff which follows on around brand and focus, system change, all that, where would you advise the big shift in civil society needs to be right now to meet this occasion?
I mean, it's hard to generalize for the points we're making about the sort of diversity of actors, but I think if we narrow it down to sort of registered charities or organized bits of civil society that have staff and boards and volunteers and all of that, which should be the strongest bits, the anchor organizations in civil society, but too often, particularly at the moment in this country, it feels like these are the most vulnerable bits, right? They're under attack, they're being defunded. They're being competed out, whatever else it is. And so there, I think there's two things. One, I've sort of said a little bit before, which is, are there experiments, demonstrations that you can, try, be part of, that shows another world is possible? And and it could be big, or it could be really small, just in your own little community or in your own little network. Do things that say, actually, we can do things in a more collaborative, democratic, egalitarian way that doesn't involve the same sort of charitable industrial complex that that people often talk about. We can sort of innovation at whatever scale is appropriate to show that things can be done differently. And then the other bit is around business model, and again, the UK in some ways has the sort of best and worst of both of the best of worlds and the worst of worlds all at once, right? Like, we're so fortunate to have such a generous public, some of the highest levels of donations in the world, or support for charities, but that also creates huge vulnerabilities, right? Or put another way, a state that for the last 25 years or so has been pumping a fair bit of resource into civil society through commissioning or contracting or grants, even in some cases, but that seems now to be withdrawing its support and leaving many of us without that source of income. And so what are those sorts of ways of building the sort of business model of the future? Because if we can't rely so much on donations from people, because the market is saturated, the return on investment is low, or the costs of recruiting supporters is so high that we're just competing with each other for the same pound. And if we can't rely on the state to provide resources via taxation to support the work that we do, then what are the other ways in which we can show impact? And it might be through social enterprise, like the shops I was talking about, or it might be just sort of recalibrating our economy to say, well, actually, maybe it's more about time, not money. And if more people are likely to have more time in the coming few years and decades, what's the successful business model that we can build where we use that time in a more creative, interesting way? And so, you end up having, NCVO in its almanac will be publishing size of charities by annual turnover. But imagine if you had a size of charity by the thousands of hours that people are giving to collaborate with each other on a voluntary basis or whatever else it is. And maybe that already exists. I haven't seen it. We certainly don't celebrate it. But again, the economy is changing, or the political economy in the UK is likely to change so fast in the coming decade or so that I think the thriving, interesting business models in civil society are also going to have to look very different. And it'd be great if a few of us can start to seed those experiments as well.
Excellent. So demonstration of better ways, innovation, but particularly linking to, as you said, at whatever scale, but related to communities, related to collaboration, related to democratic process, etc., demonstrating different models. But then also the business model, the nuts and bolts of financing an organization, social enterprise you talked about. There are other models on there, sort of outcome-based finance and all those kind of things that we're starting to explore. Sarah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it connects with Camna's question, I think, in the chat, and I hope I've pronounced your
It
name
is a
right.
good question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really important one, actually. And I think, yeah, because this is also what we've done before, right? Is that we've allowed the most vulnerable in society to carry the biggest burden. And by just saying, communities can handle it, actually, that is doing that again. So I think what I'm talking about is a reorientation of the way we apply our resources. So certainly as Mind, we have started to change the way in which we consider. We're a federation, so we're part of a massive network of organisations that are independent, but that we retain historically have retained the most power and the most money. And my plan is, over a period of time, is that we deconstruct Mind as a kind of national body and use it as a kind of resource that both supports funding of our federation, that does all of the stuff that really convenes, creates that safety, that we recognise what our limitations are, that we step back from things that actually are being done elsewhere, but that we support the elsewhere, that we instead of doing so, for instance, and we have, we're well versed in this, but when we ask mothers to provide mental health support, that we provide the mothers with the support, right? And so that's effectively our strategy going forward, that no community can take on any task just because we've said you're a better place to do it. I mean, that in of itself is incredibly arrogant. So I think there is that, and also working with people about what is it that you need? Because we did a lot of work with our racialized community partners, and they were like, you know what, we literally only need your money. We don't need your training. We don't need that. And we don't need this. And we were like, okay, cool. That's fine. And we know where we stand. And we know that that work is going to be done, and it's going to be done beautifully. And I think there is something for me about making those brave decisions about resourcing, making those decisions about actually it's not going to be our logo on the tin. And again, this is not new news. We've been doing this for, God, I've been talking about this for 20 years. It doesn't matter who does it as long as it gets done. But the reality is, I think that, certainly at Mind, the financial business models really need to be attacked. And so I couldn't agree with Danny more that I think one of the biggest things that we could do is trial those new models of business, finance, partnership, investment, co-investment, sharing resource, etc. Also new leadership models. A great friend of a couple of us on the call, Karen Bradshaw, has just been leading a massive change at Charity Finance Group, which is now creating co-chief execs. So again, you've got new models of leadership that allow you to think differently, operate differently, demonstrate values differently. So I think there's something about brave decision making, but fundamentally it's also about handing over the money and just, reorientating resources.
I was going to ask you a little bit about leadership as we draw towards the close of our time, because you've talked there about effectively thinking more systemically about your role in relation to all of these other organizations, whether that's your federated partners or whether that's different types of organizations in different places, and transferring or building the power of others, focusing how you resource and where you resource and where you step back, financial business models, etc. But you also talk there about new models of leadership, and And I wonder how related all these things are, because working more systemically, working more in a federated way, a lot of that is the reason that we don't do it, I think, or historically haven't done it, is because of the conflict that we then have to navigate. If you do that, it's a lot easier to have the control. You talked about this right at the beginning, to have the control as fairly autocratic organization. We work within our footprint. We don't need to do all this partnership work and community building. And for me, and shoot me down, but build on this if you want. But I think one of the critical skills of leadership going forward is our ability to navigate conflict, and not just leadership at CEO level, but leadership sort of organizationally. Is how do we have the confidence to be able to share the authority and to share the control with lots of other organizations without being scared of losing control and therefore having to fight. So what do you, I guess that's my little soapbox, but I'd be interested to know both of your thoughts on what this means for civil society leaders like yourselves.
So shall I jump in? So it's, I mean, two things, I suppose. One is that, I mean, coming back to the sort of sectoral view, I think we're also paying the price of, I don't know, maybe 50 years or so, where there was a sort of size fetishism or a growth fetishism amongst British civil society, where we sort of started, we had the sort of emergence of these super brands that were, so big and so well recognized, amazing in some ways. Very few other countries have what we have, but then you end up with too much attention on the bigger end of the spectrum, and not enough resources, innovation, attention, care at the rest. And I think that it's starting to correct itself, and I think some lots of actors are starting to work together and collaborate in more interesting ways. So there's a sort of leadership question about, like, I think the sort of true innovation and true leadership in civil society is going to come from bits of civil society that we probably don't recognize today, and that is or not quite as sort of important bits of civil society. The other thing, which I think Sarah's already sort of started to take us down, is that it is really difficult, I think, today to be in any form of leadership position in civil society for a whole bunch of reasons, because of resourcing, because of digital disruption, hybrid working you were talking about, workplace culture. But I find it's also difficult for one reason, which sometimes feels very difficult and annoying, but is actually empowering. And that is because if you're to be a truly sort of an authentic leader, an effective leader, a feminist leader, then you have to walk the talk when it comes to giving away power, shifting power, decolonizing our institutions, whatever. And that's really unsettling and difficult, because all that stuff we've been told and started to believe ourselves, it's about letting some of that go and doing things differently. It's very unsettling, but it can also be really empowering, both for us, the individual, but also I think for the institution. And I certainly, that was, Martyn, you said it was 5 tricky years at Oxfam. It was also 5 years in which I learned a huge amount, because Oxfam, as many of you will know, has been working on feminist leadership principles for years, long before I started, talking about notions of power with, not just power over and power to. Putting some of that into practice in management life, it wasn't easy, but huge, and was certainly not perfect. I'm not saying it was all job done by any means, but it was hugely empowering. And so there are sort of new forms of leadership that I think we should also be trying to sort of lean into in civil society, because we're going to be held to account probably to far higher standards than most others in society, because of the sort of nature of things we do and the organizations we work in.
And Sarah, your thoughts on leadership and the implications for?
I mean, I just agree with Danny. I think we've got to create space for giving up power, the discomfort of that, the risk. So it's a perceived and real risk. So I think you have to do some real good thinking from a personal reflective point of view, but also how do you activate it from a governance risk point of view so that you can push and push. And sometimes that's about also knowing that you're going into the unknown and finding a way of tolerating that. And I think that that's certainly something I think is important. I really do think peer support is critical, and I talk about it all the time. If it wasn't for, people like Kate on the call, or Catherine I can see here, and Ndidi and others, that, I wouldn't survive the role. And finding people that you can be incredibly vulnerable with, and who can tell you, you're being a bit of an idiot, or, actually you're fine, or you're a bit of a cow. I think all of those things, having those people that can have, Kate doesn't call me a cow all the time. She's going to be the chief exec of NCVO occasionally, just occasionally. I just do think that's really important. And, creating that kind of sense of people that not all, we don't want to also kind of say the same thing. We want to have challenging and dissenting voices and people that are different. And so I think my plea for leadership is make sure that you make space for others and take advice. Because, we don't know it all. And I think the biggest thing that I've done is keep my ego in check.
So we've talked about, just bringing this to a close then, we've talked about a lot of things, from civic freedoms and the authoritarian control tendencies. We've talked about the power of an active vocal civil society. We've talked about coming together, community ownership. We've talked about power sharing, a whole load of stuff. In a nutshell, this is the quick fire round. What is the one thing that you would hope that people who've been listening to us today would take away? Go on, Sarah.
I just think, that there is hope, that there are things happening that are seismic. We've just got to find them, keep in touch with them, and try it out. And don't be frightened. I think it's a new world, but we've got skills to bring. Just because I'm a boomer doesn't mean, no, I'm not a boomer. I'm a Gen Xer. Just get my generations right. I've got stuff to offer. I still know stuff. Be brave and curious.
Danny, your one thing.
So there's lots of things that are wrong and worrying in society, as you listed some of those, Martyn, at the start. But amidst all that uncertainty and those threats is also a moment of huge opportunity. And it's if I ask myself, who do I trust more to innovate and show that another world is possible, that say we can rewire our economy so that people and planet do matter, so that we can make our democracy more participatory and liquid and everyday? Do I trust our elected political leaders? Do I trust our corporate titans? Or do I trust civil society? And I trust civil society. I would back us to be to sow the seeds of the future. And we've done it in so many other parts of the world, and we celebrate amazing civic movements that have toppled autocracy and champion gender rights, or the rights of sexual minorities, or whatever else it is. We've achieved amazing, as Sarah says, seismic changes in societies in the past. Right now in contemporary Britain, it probably feels like we don't have the upper hand, but we've got to, unless we back ourselves, we will have lost this moment for the huge opportunity.
That's a positive and inspiring way to finish. And I would expect nothing less. Thank you, both of you. That was fabulous. And thank you so much to everybody who's chimed in on the chat as well. Some brilliant points made, lots of validation, really, of the points that you've made, and agreements and that sort of thing. I would just double down on Sarah's point about peer group support and finding that support. If you are struggling and you need linking into people, just drop me a note. I know lots of people have their own networks already, but there's groups that I do, and there's learning groups and and there's lots of people that I know, and I'm more than happy to connect you. The next call that we're doing, next in conversation that we're going to be doing, isn't until November. In October, I'm going to be doing some training delivered via Akivo on leading systems change. So if you're interested in that, then go to Akivo on their website in the training section. There's a day that I'm going to be doing with them on that. But the next one of these that we're having is with the fantastic Lynn Perry and Mark Russell, who are chief execs of two of the big children's charities, talking about building high impact coalitions. So kind of building on what we talked about today, but really about how they're trying to shift the dial on children's rights and all of that good stuff by building coalitions and collaborating. And that will be on November the 13th. It's now live on the website if you want to register. But other than that, it's just for me to say, Danny, Sarah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for doing that. And any of you who've joined today, if you want to join me again on the 13th of November, just register and let me know. And hopefully I will see you there.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
everybody. Take care.
everyone. See you. Take care.